Welcome everyone to another Get Legit webinar. This is Pest Management and Prevention for Your Garden with Nate Braun. Today is Thursday, July 24th, 2025. My name is Erin, and I am the Education and Communications Manager here at the Cannabis Alliance. I'd like to thank you for joining us this afternoon. It is our hope that anyone interested in commercial cannabis here in Nevada County will take the time to tune into these webinars, educate themselves, and continue to be or become stewards of the environment and of our community. The Get Legit educational series provides the preparation necessary to assist in securing a local cultivation permit and a state cultivation license. The series includes webinars, support groups, business skills training, and a mentor program. And all Get Legit webinars are online, free of charge, and open to the public. So what is the Alliance? We are a nonprofit trade association representing the local cannabis community here in Nevada County. Our mission is to support public policy initiatives through representative advocacy, provide educational opportunities, and create space for connection within the industry and greater community. Some services that we provide to our members are a consistent voice and representation locally and at the statewide level. We have monthly educational webinars to assist with the permitting and licensing process, much like the one you are on today. We have a buddy program to pair permitted farmers with new farmers, and a Slack online hub for resource sharing and local policy updates, as well as seasonal supply chain industry mixers. So there are ways to stay in touch with us. You can become a member, you can become a sponsor, you can follow us on Facebook, it's at Nevada County Cannabis Alliance, or on Instagram, which is at Nevada County Alliance. And you can also join and subscribe to our bi-monthly newsletter. I will link all the ways in which you can stay in touch with us in the chat. We have a really fun event coming up that we're really excited about. It's our second annual barbecue cook-off and cornhole tournament that's going to be held on September 25th, 2025. It will start at 4 p.m. at Western Gateway Park. Come out and taste some seriously delicious barbecue, compete in our cornhole tournament. It's always a lot of fun, and it's a great way to meet people in the cannabis industry and connect. I'd like to give a shout out to our allied industry business sponsors, Ag Natural, Finest, Humboldt Seed Company, Mr. B's Green Trees, Gold Coast Botanicals, and Elevation 24/7. The format of today's webinar will be a Q&A format with a presentation by Nate Braun. Your participation is encouraged. There's a chat section and a Q&A section. Feel free to use that. And please ask as many questions that you may have as it will make the webinar more useful for everyone. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website at nccannabisalliance.org under the Get Legit tab. I will also link that in the chat. And that is it for me. I will go ahead and pass it along to Nate to introduce himself. Thank you so much for being here, Nate. Welcome.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Erin. Thanks for having me on here. I'm Nate Braun, as she mentioned, longtime cannabis grower and longtime employee here at Ag Natural here in Grass Valley. So today we're going to talk about pest management, integrated pest management, and how to treat it, how to prevent it, and to keep these pesky bugs out of our garden. So today we're going to be covering prevention, as well as how to get rid of an active infestation, biological controls like predatory bugs to apply, different mechanical controls, as well as sprays to keep your garden productive over the summer, and most importantly, so that we can test clean at the end of our growing season, which is most important to everyone. So we're going to start talking about the most common pests that we all deal with on a daily basis, or at least that we're thinking about daily in our gardens, such as spider mites, thrips, aphids, broad and russet mites, fungus gnats, caterpillars, all these different insects that come after our garden, and things that we need to pay attention to and to prevent them. Most importantly, prevention is number one. It's always better to prevent something than to react to it 100% of the time. So with that, we'll just kind of get in and start kind of talking about our pest management. Like I said, prevention is one of the number one things that we deal with. We should be thinking about prevention every day when we're in our gardens going through, and it starts with a clean start, whether you're gathering these clones from large nurseries in bulk for your garden and bringing them in, quarantining plants right from the get-go and separating them from your main garden, and doing some treatments before you introduce them into your garden are going to be really key factors into things that to start a successful growing season. And then having environmental controls, making sure that our landscapes and things aren't overgrown into things that, basically make an environment for these insects to kind of, multiply into. So starting with a clean environment is going to be the most important thing that we start with always, and keeping it that way. As we always say, cleanliness is godliness, and that plays a big factor into our gardens. So having a clean start, making sure that we don't have any overgrowth and things next to our gardens, and things like that. So integrated pest management, when we talk about that, we think about not just doing one thing repetitively, it's a multi-stage process that really makes it productive, whether it's, sprays that we're going to be doing throughout our weekly sprays and preventative sprays, keeping, like I said, that clean environment, uh, laying out, doing mechanical controls, and then, really importantly, when we get into flowering periods, we're going to talk about, beneficial insects that we can apply. That way we're not using heavy sprays or doing things in flower that we shouldn't be doing that are going to kind of maybe come back later. And maybe make it so we don't test clean, or maybe have a product that, isn't as to par as we want. Um, keeping up on weekly sprays and using things that are compliant with California regulations are super important. Using things, insecticidal soaps are great to use. Certain things in the vegetative stage are really good to use. Early on, it's great to do your preventatives using things that maybe you don't want to use closer to flower periods, but are fine to use in your vegetative stage, like uh, things like thrips, and using like spinosad or something like that, early on in your like clone stage or really early development. In your vegetative stage are fine, but you don't want to be using things like this later in your flowering period. So when you're bringing in clones or you're taking clones from your own garden, it's important to quarantine, but also treat those plants, effectively before you bring them into your garden. Is really important. Also, being able to identify these pests, properly identifying them is super important, because sometimes you might misidentify something, and now that infestation, or what wasn't an infestation, is turning into one now because of misidentification. So really important to kind of know what you're looking for. Keeping a microscope on hand is always super beneficial. That way you can properly identify the insects. Certain insects prods and rust. It's really crucial to have a piece of equipment like that on hand. To make sure you're identifying these insects properly. That way you know how to treat them on hand. Using organic sprays, different applications. It's really important to get, when you're doing a spray, to have a full coverage of your plant. That way it's super productive, and you're not going to miss having a full saturation in your plant from the underside of the leaf all the way from your soil base all the way up to the top of the plant. Uh, so those are all super important things to talk about there. Talking about environmental controls, like I said, like really keeping your properties clean, your garden areas clean is going to be, a number one thing that's going to be beneficial to you moving forward in your season on there. And then, moving into like flowering periods, which we're, now we're in the middle of our season over here. So probably, if you're doing depths, or you've already pulled down, or you're replanting, or you're just getting into your flower periods, you're going to want to back off of all these sprays. Ideally, we don't want to spray anything, in our flower periods, which is why I want to touch base on biological control, such as like beneficial insects, or, going to be your best friend, in my opinion, during your flowering period. So like, usually spraying up through your first week of flower should be okay, but you're going to want to start introducing beneficial insects such as Californicus, predatory mites, or Swartskis. There's different predatory insects that we can use that are super beneficial to our gardens that are going to really help us have a clean product when we come out. So we test clean, and if you do extracts and things, there's no residue. These are great things to apply during our flowering period. Is beneficial insects. Applying them, usually if you're done spraying and you're in your second, third week is a great time to start applying them, or even in your first week. And you're probably going to do a couple applications to apply them. Usually when you order predatory insects, they'll come in little sachets that you can separate through your garden and divide them evenly so you have a full coverage. Usually you'll do it like week 2. You can apply them again in week 4. You'll probably do it 2 to 3 different times, and this will ensure that you're not having to spray come like week 6 or week 7 when you're in a crucial part of your flowering period. You don't want to have, the beginning of an infestation pop up. So using these biological controls is going to be very important in testing clean through there. So, and then I don't know if there's any questions thus far, but we're just basically going to be talking about being able to keep these areas clean, doing our weekly sprays. Hopefully everybody's been keeping up on that through the season because we're pretty far into the season already. So doing these preventatives are going to be things that are going to be benefiting us later on in our growing periods, especially in our flowering periods.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions so far, feel free to raise your hand and you can either speak or you can just ask your question in the Q&A, but feel free to use that as we go along. And Pat has a question.
Okay.
Does heat affect beneficials?
Yes. So when I was saying to apply them multiple times, this is the exact reason for it. So, most beneficial insects have a heat threshold, whereas, a lot of you can have a greenhouse with spider mites and it could be 120 degrees in your greenhouse and your plants are thriving. They're doing great, but maybe you're starting to have a little bit of an infestation. And that's where spider mites really thrive, is in these big heat environments. So most predatory insects, they have a threshold from like 95 degrees up to about 105 degrees where they start to diminish. So yeah, heat does play a very big factor into these things, which is why usually when we use beneficial insects, especially in the summer months, where we're at right now, it's very beneficial to apply them multiple times, every 2 weeks or so in your garden to assure that we have, no issues with it. Californicus is a species of predatory mites that has a higher threshold for heat. And it's also a really productive mite. It eats broads. It eats two-spotted broads, russets, it'll eat aphids, thrips. It covers a broad range of insects that it'll treat. And it has a higher threshold for heat, where it's like some other predatory mites don't kind of have that threshold and they'll kind of diminish after when we get these big heat waves, whereas spider mites, as absolutely love it and they will just thrive in it. I see Pat asking about lacewings. Lacewings are, for aphid control, they're amazing, and they'll stick around a little bit longer than like a ladybug or something that can kind of, leave. Whereas when you apply lacewings, you get them in an egg form and it takes a few days, maybe up to a week for them to hatch out and start being productive and start consuming the aphids. But they'll stick around longer because they don't go into their adult stage where they get wings and can leave, until they're adults. So this happens over a longer period of time. So lacewings are a great option for aphid control. As well as Californicus predatory mites that I've mentioned. Those are both really good predatory insects. I prefer lacewings over ladybugs just because I find they stick around longer and they're actually a little bit more productive with how much they'll eat in a single day with aphids. So those are both really good options, especially, if you're growing organically. We don't want us to be spraying our crops ideally, which is why these predatories are really crucial and important during our growing cycles. Yeah. Thanks for that question. Yeah. So those are really heat does play a factor into it. So I like to apply when I do predatory mites. I apply them usually in week 2, especially in the summer months, and then I'll do it usually every 2 weeks until I get to like my 6th week. I'll do a last application. That'll usually carry me through harvest, where we're not having to do any sprays during our flowering period. So I hope that answered that question. Whereas spider mites, aphids. I feel like these are 2 things that we most commonly deal with in our industry. They're prevalent everywhere. Even just on our property. They're always around. Doing like little perimeter sprays, especially if you have a setting where maybe you have a lot of foliage, in surrounding areas around your greenhouses or your field, wherever you're growing. It's good to do little treatments around there as well, or release lace wings if you don't want to do sprays to kind of keep these things at bay. That way they're not, kind of creeping into our garden as our season goes on. Because as we get these heat waves and the summer progresses, that's when we really get these issues, So if we're not keeping up on our preventative measures to get these things done in the springtime and in the early part of the season, we're going to run into issues when these big heat waves come in with these insects when they're really thriving out in our environment. Now, voles, boy, I'll tell you, that's a tricky one to get rid of. There's like little things that you can kind of do to keep them at bay. I mean, from my experience, I mean, they can be a big pain and they can be detrimental to your garden. They can burrow in. If you have garden beds, they can kind of burrow in and pull plants down from the bottom. I mean, getting rid of them, eradicating them, it can be very difficult. I've had good luck with like castor oil granulars and spreading those around my garden area and kind of keep them at bay. Laying traps might not, be for everyone, but when we're guarding our crops, and you're having an issue with this, sometimes getting someone out there and figuring out how you can lay traps down might be the most productive thing to do, especially maybe in your off season, seeing if there's a specialist that can come out and see if there's a way to kind of, get them out of your property, get them to move on to a different location, because especially in the summertime, it's dry, it's a drought. We live in a drought area. So when, our garden beds, our garden, it's a lush area, I feel like they kind of gravitate towards that, and it can be kind of a point that they just kind of go to. Voles are very, tricky to kind of get rid of as they burrow in the ground, colonizing rodents. So it's usually, if you have one of them, there's usually a lot of them. So they can be kind of tricky to get rid of. I would, having someone come out and kind of see how they can mitigate that on your property. But traps or castor oil granulars are a good way to kind of start that process, to kind of get you through your harvest so you're not losing plants in the middle of your season. Yeah, you could try that, planting some onions, but who knows? Maybe they're stinky enough that they won't want to be around them. Like I said, I've had good luck with sprinkling castor oil granulars around my garden area. I feel like when they get in contact with it, kind of makes them sick and they'll kind of stay away from that area, hopefully. That would be ideal. Is castor oil okay for the plants? Yeah, I haven't had any negative effect with it. I usually, when I apply it, I won't really apply. I usually apply it around the garden area, whether it's a raised bed or a smart pot, whatever growing area you're in. I'll usually put it around that area, as a deterrent mostly. If you're having a really bad issue with it, which I've seen in lots of gardens, it can be a lot of maintenance to do it, but traps are, maybe it's not ideal as it may be. If you're having an issue with it, that's something you should consider is getting some good spring traps to lay out for those things to get them out of your garden. And then, we're coming into our fall months. We're getting ready to. We're in the end of our summer. We're going to start flowering soon. We're still in summer, but we're going to start hitting that big stretch. If you got full term season plants out there, Or if you're midway in a flowering period, we should start thinking about caterpillars as well, because they're going to start dropping down and start being really prevalent around this time of year, moving on through, fall. So, maybe doing a preventative spray with like a BT caterpillar killer is something you should probably be starting to think about, because it's going to be, especially if you're in a greenhouse setting and you're flowering, they can kind of drop in, as any of you know that have dealt with them, they can rack havoc on your tops and all your pretty flowers that you want to be harvesting and getting onto market. So caterpillars are going to be something that we're going to start seeing here in the next, coming weeks if you're not already dealing with them. So getting some preventative sprays, BT, the way it works when you spray it on a plant, it has to be consumed by the caterpillar for it to be effective. So it needs to be present on the plant for it to be effective. So usually come mid-flowering period when your buds are stacking, it's good to start doing preventative measures, and spraying at least every 2 weeks to 10 days, doing an application for them, through your flowering periods. One of the only things that I'd probably say is in your flowering period to spray, because it's going to be the only way that we really prevent them from, getting into our crops here, is be using like a BT, a bacillus to prevent that from caterpillar damage. Um, which it's you're gonna start thinking about that you're in your flowering period about midway through on there. So I mean, you should start thinking about that. And then if you're not in your flowering period, it's a really good time to start ramping up and doing your preventative sprays, because we are going to go into flower very soon. We're in the last week of July, which is usually, depending on the strains that we grow, the last week of July up to maybe the second week of August. We're going to hit that transition period where we don't really want to be spraying anymore after that. Once we start stacking and setting on our bud sites, we really want to leave it alone and start using these biological controls. So right now is a phenomenal time of year to really, either ramp it up or just stay on schedule with your sprays. And then also, with most any insects, building up a resilience to the things we spray, which is IPM. It's using multiple different techniques to kind of keep these pests at bay, spraying being one of them. So keeping up on your weekly sprays, I always recommend keeping a calendar and a log. That way you're aware, each week you can mark in your calendar, we sprayed this product. That way, the next week to kind of switch it up to use a different product. As a lot of these insects, if you use one product consistently, they're going to build an immunity to it. And then, you might be scratching your head like, oh man, I've been spraying every week. Why am I getting these issues still? Well, it's usually because, like, especially mites and things will build an immunity to these things and kind of a resilience to them. So it's really good to kind of switch up what we're spraying each week and keeping a log of it. That way it's documented, and next week what you're going to be using, so you can make a good plan for that. That's really crucial to kind of be switching up the things that you're using in your gardens. That way, that we don't build an immunity to these mites and things. That way, when you're in week 4, week 5 of flower, you don't want to be dealing with any of these things. Which is why I always say, it's better to prevent something than to react to it. Because when you're reacting to something, you're really limited on, how you can control that situation at that point. Which is why it's super crucial to stay up on our preventative measures to keep our gardens clean so we can test clean and have a really good, productive, amazing crop. So that's super important. And even like in between runs, if you're pulling down a greenhouse and you're ready to reset that thing, you got your next rounds ready to rip, you're ready to plant, you want to turn it and burn it. It's good. Take an afternoon, take a day, get your crew out there, scrub your walls, clean your area. Pull if you got some weeds that came in that grew up, maintain all of these things, because they can be a habitat that you might not think about, that these insects are just kind of chilling in, and they're just waiting, to take over wherever they can. So keeping a really clean area, going through maybe, leaking down your walls in your greenhouse in between runs, making sure that you are pulling weeds, maybe even in between runs, doing like, a good heavy sulfur spray on, maybe your ground cover and things, when you don't have an active crop in there during flowering period, can kind of set things back from like a sulfur is great for like broads, rustets. It's one thing that's super productive for them. Obviously, we don't want to use it in flour, but it's a good thing to kind of sanitize your soil or even the ground around it. If you have foliage in your greenhouse, remove it. But these are things that are great preventatives. That way, when you're going into your next round after you've harvested, if there's something that was in your harvest that you're afraid might be lingering around, you know, taking those measures is going to be really beneficial to keep a clean garden space. That way, you're not dealing with these issues on your next round or even your next season. So, always keep a clean environment. That's super important. Uh, you know, and in the vegetative stage, which a lot of us are in, maybe if we're doing full terms, there's a lot more accessibility to the things that we can spray, that could be a little systemic and stay in there a little bit longer that we want to stay out of in flower. Like I said, it's great to just switch up what you're spraying or what you're using to, as your preventatives. That way we don't build an immunity to these plants, as their flowering periods or their life cycles go on through the end of the season here. Um,
Hey Nate, I have a question.
yeah,
Um, what would be so you're talking about changing up your sprays, like different brands or different types of
exactly.
tools?
Well, brands and the substances that are in them, so great preventatives are things with like essential oils in them, or insecticidal soaps are also great. So each time we spray, each week, if you're doing a weekly spray each week, say you used neem oil in your vegetative stage when they're young, or insecticidal soap, or, maybe pyganic, something with perithians or azera or sulfur, it's great to switch these different products that we're using that have different active ingredients in them. That way, like I said, so that things don't build an immunity to them and it's way more productive, uh, for your plants to kind of switch these things up. So, if you use spinosad one week for thrips or something, mark that in your calendar and then the next week switch over to maybe something that's essential oil based, like plant therapy. There's a bunch of different products on the market that are super productive. But it's great each week to kind of mark that in your calendar. This is what we use next week. Make a plan, for what you're going to spray, and having that plan, ahead of time is going to make your garden super successful. You know, but yeah, switching up our sprays that we're going to be using each week is super beneficial. That way, well, insects, they build an immunity to it, so that's why it's super important to kind of to switch those things up, like insecticidal soap is great. It's gentle on predatory insects, and you can use it parts of the way through flower. I don't really recommend spraying in flower, but maybe the first week or two before you set your bud sites are set, these are great things to spray before you set these predatory insects. Uh, so always kind of switch it up, keep a nice catalog of different sprays on deck so that you or your employees can switch it up each week, and definitely keep a calendar. That way, you're not doing something repetitive, that you can kind of keep a log of it, and I think that's great to do in your garden in general, whether it's an IPM or your nutrition program, whatever nutrients you're supplying, always keep a good journal of what you do, that way you kind of what's working, so when you move forward, later in the season or next year, what works, you got a catalog of it, and it just keeps you on track better as well in your garden. So hopefully that answered your question there.
Pat, yes, it did. Thank you so much. That was great. Pat made a recommendation for plant resilience, silica. Do you know anything much about that? Can you speak to that?
Well, silica is great as a foliar. It helps with a lot of things. It's going to help build up the cell walls. It's going to strengthen your plant. It helps, especially when we get these heat waves and things. It's really great for like environmental issues like heat stress and things like that. So I think silica is a great foliar. You should definitely be putting that into your IPM program. and as it strengthens your plant, when you have a plant with an amazing immunity, uh, a really healthy plant, it makes it more resilient. It makes more of a healthy plant kind of makes a hostile environment for the insects. It's not, the best situation for them to breed and produce, so silica is always a great foliar on your plants. It does, there's a lot of benefits to do the spraying of silica based spray in there. It's definitely beneficial to do that. So yeah, I would recommend getting some of those sprays in there. It's going to help with a lot of different things, especially in these summer months when we're in these big heat waves. It'll kind of help build up some strength in your plant and keep it more productive. Definitely. So spraying, like I touched on when we first started, is getting a full coverage of your plant. Especially when they're young, it's easier to kind of get a full coverage. When we get these big monster plants, I know it's big and tedious. You're out in the field for hours spraying. Spraying can get costly. Whether it's the hourlies that you're putting into it or just what you're spraying can be costly. So making sure that we get a full coverage in our preventatives, especially in the early stages of our plants when they're younger and smaller, and keeping up on top of that will help it. So when you're getting into your flower period and your plants stretch and they double, triple in size and you have way more canopy to deal with, you'll be way better off, so having a full coverage. And whether you're using a backpack sprayer or an atomizer or these huge foggers for greenhouse settings, you really just want to make sure that you're getting a full coverage. Most all of these insects don't hang out on the tops of plants. The only time you really see them on the tops of plants is when you have an infestation. So really focusing on the inside of your plant, the undersides of your leaves, is really crucial, as that's usually, that's where all the eggs are laid behind, where the larva hangs out. So you want to get definitely a full coverage when you're doing these sprays. That way it's super productive and nothing's left behind. So that way when you keep doing your preventatives, you stay up on it. When you get into your flower period, you're not going to have these issues, especially going into your later weeks of flower. It's super important. Which is, that's when, you'll start putting those predatory insects that we were talking about earlier, which are very productive to do. So keeping a full coverage, paint sprayers work really good. Foggers, atomizers work really well. They can cover a good distance. I like foggers because I find I'm using less product in my fogger and I'm getting a full coverage out of it. There's a bunch of them on the market that work really well. Um, but using something like an atomizer or a paint sprayer, something that you can get a really good coverage with, and like atomizers, I feel like they go, I can get it to go a little further than I can like a backpack sprayer that has larger droplets. I feel like a lot of it, goes onto the plant, a lot of it drips onto the ground, whereas the fogger usually gets a full coverage of your plant. You're just going to want to really focus on, going from the bottom of your plant up and really focusing on, the inner side of your leaf, the bottom side of your leaf where those, eggs and larvae can hang out, on there, like aphids, they can be a pain, but usually even, with something that's good and pressurized like an atomizer, usually, whatever you're spraying is going to kill those adults or knock them off or whatever, and then usually your second application for aphids will usually get rid of them, as long as you don't have a terrible infestation. But focusing on a full coverage when you're doing your sprays is super important. That way you don't miss anything on there. And that's why we spray weekly too. One of the goals of pest management is breaking up the breeding schedule of these insects like spider mites. So say you have a little issue, you see some spotting on your leaves and you say, well, I'm starting to get a little bit of an issue. Breaking up that breeding schedule cycle by spraying like every other day or even a couple times through the week if you're having an issue, that's super beneficial. You're breaking up their breeding schedule. So as those adults are dying off, their eggs are left behind. So that next day or over periods of time, a short period of time, those eggs are now hatching out, which is why, spraying every other day is super, super crucial especially during an infestation or the beginning of one. You want to really break up that breeding cycle. That's really the goal, is breaking up their breeding cycle, to get rid of them. The best way to get rid of them is to kind of focus on their breeding cycles and to kind of plan for that during your IPM sprays. So that's something to really keep in the front of your mind, is breaking that breeding cycle up during an active infestation. Usually if you're not dealing with an infestation, just keep up on your weekly sprays. Those are super crucial. Like we were saying, switching up what you're spraying each week. And if you're dealing with an infestation, which sometimes it's inevitable, we all deal with it. We've all been doing this long enough that we've dealt with spider mites and webbing and all the terrible things that come with it. So breaking up that breeding cycle for these insects, and spraying every other day. And it could take up to a 10-day period to really, eradicate or just kind of get it, under control. So that's a good mentality to have, especially when you have an active issue, is being on top of it, spraying every other day. And then doing rinses in between, with just straight plain water. If you're going to spray something like sulfur or something that has a heavy residue, neem oil, something that leaves a residue behind, it's great to spray those things. They're going to get rid of the pests if they leave a residue. So doing a rinse in between is super crucial as well. And the rinse can kind of really help it too, because if you're spraying your plants down regularly, you're making an environment that's not great for these insects to kind of thrive in. So it's great to do a big rinse in between these foliars as well. These sprays. It's just like the plain water, especially like aphids. It'll knock them off. It makes an inhabitable space for them to kind of thrive in. And your plants probably wouldn't mind getting hosed down anyway. Kind of getting some of that buildup off of the plant. Doing a nice water rinse in between these IPM sprays can be super productive as well.
Nate, Pat has a question. If you have a sheet that is available with acceptable sprays and beneficials and biologicals for specific pests?
I do have some stuff printed up, and I'll tell you, I will probably, I'll post them to this page when we're out of here. You know, when we get out of here, I do have some lists of things that are acceptable, that are compliant through California, whether it's the vegetative stage, and then I can print out another page, for our bloom cycle of things, because ideally we want to test clean. That's the goal at the end of our season. So I can print up a list. I have a list of things that are acceptable through California regulation for our gardens that we can use. So I'll figure out a way. I'll get that over to you. And I'll tell you, you guys can always stop in Ag Natural too. I'm here Sunday through Thursday. But maybe I'll print some things out, because I do have a list, of different things that are acceptable, whether what stage you're in, whether it's Grand Devo, Venerate. There's a lot of products on the market that are great, that are super productive, that work really well, that will test clean, that you won't have an issue with, that won't be systemic. So I hope that helps, and I can kind of try to get that list over to all of you.
Yeah, and I can help with that as well. If you want to print that up and just send it to me, I can make sure to email it to everyone on the list who was registered, and I will add it to the video. I don't know, I'll take a picture of it and incorporate it into the
Yeah,
editing.
I got a few of them, whether we're dealing with like, broads, russets, two spotteds, I'll probably print out a list for mites, because a lot of these things, aphids, I'll probably print out a different list, or thrips a different list. I'll make a detailed list of things that are compliant through California. That'll be very productive, uh, for you guys to use through your season.
Perfect. That's awesome. Thank you so much, Nate.
Yeah, and yeah, that's what we're here for. So. Because I mean, the last thing that anybody wants is to work your butt off all year long in your gardens. And then at the end of the year, be non-compliant because we test dirty because there's something systemic in there, there's, and like kind of waiting, there's a lot of circumstances, that play into a factor. Like if you wait until week 3 to kind of get on top of things in your flower period, it could be too late. And now, especially like broads and russets, like you need to be on top of that. Usually that's like a springtime thing. I start thinking about broads and russets really early on in the season because they'll come out in cooler temperatures. But if you wait till like week 3 or 4 or something, to kind of deal with an issue, it's too late at this point. Now you're really limited on what you can do to control this, and it's usually going to be having to spray something at that point, which we don't want to do. That's why I always say, prevent, prevent, prevent. Always do your sprays, stay on top of it, keep your property clean, having, tall foliage, around your garden. This is just a perfect habitat for these aphids, mites, and everything to kind of hang out in. And even in your off season, kind of keeping it in the forefront of your mind. If you have an off season out of your garden, making sure that you do keep it clean. That way come springtime or when you're ready to plant again, you have a healthy environment. And that's what all IPM's all about, is having a healthy environment. It's not always about just spraying and eradicating something, because we want our environment to be healthy. That we want our beneficials to be healthy, and just all around, just a healthy garden. So keeping things clean, super crucial. Even in the off season, to be thinking about these things. Usually, like if in my greenhouses when I'm done planting, or if when I shut down for the season, I'll usually do a huge coverage of a micronized sulfur in there. And, if I don't plant for another month, I usually just let it sit in there. Then I'll do a big spray. I'll spray down all the surfaces when I'm a little ahead of time before I want to plant. But keeping these things in mind in our off season is really important too, because a lot of these insects will go dormant. And where we live, we don't get hard freezes in a lot of the parts of Nevada County that we live in. So these insects, they can go dormant in colder months, but they're still there. They're very present. So after you finish a crop, maybe your harvest isn't always done. You should think, when your stuff's in the dry room, your garden's cleaned out, go out there and do a big heavy spray on the surfaces. Because anything left behind after you harvest, it's gonna just sit there. It's gonna go dormant. Has the potential to do that. And then when you go and plant next season, when the temperatures warm back up in the springtime and things, that's when everything gets active. So it's good to keep a clean environment, and also just think about IPM, through the season. Even if you have an off season, it's important to kind of keep that in the front of your mind. That way we're not dealing with it when you don't want to be dealing with it. So that's super important to do. Yeah. So let's see. But yeah, just to touch up on things, anytime you're out in the garden, you should be scouting. If you're playing out in the garden, you're watering, hanging out, whatever it is you're working, whatever project you're doing, you know, go plant the plant when you can, turn some leaves over and things and see what you got. And another great way to really mitigate and get rid of a lot of these pests is, when you do a spray, cleaning up your plants, getting rid of these excess big leaves and lower foliage that's not going to be productive. It's things that you're not going to harvest anyway. Removing that completely from your garden is so crucial, because, even though as much as IPM sprays as you have, the lower part, the shadier part of the plant, that's where a lot of these insects kind of just really propagate and kind of do their thing. So by removing that, putting it in a bag and removing it from your property, don't throw it in your compost pile, don't put it on the far end of your property, literally get rid of it. Because if you're removing it to a different part of your property, you're really just putting it in a different area. So really cleaning up your plants, is super crucial, because you're going to be removing the larvae, the eggs, and whatever adults are left behind. So definitely, keep your plants cleaned up. That's super important as well, because you're going to be removing a lot of these eggs that you might not be able to see with the naked eye. Which is why microscopes are important. But really removing those is going to be really beneficial, because you're taking that population from your active garden and you're removing it. You're taking it completely out of here. So that's gonna, that's could be 50% of the battle right there, is just removing things that aren't necessary on your plant, your lower branches, the large fan leaves, and by doing that, you're letting light in, you're letting more air flow in, the airflow is really crucial in these things too, having a really good environment for your plant. So kind of getting rid of any excess foliage and removing it completely can be really beneficial, because you're going to be taking these eggs and larvae that left behind that maybe your IPM spray didn't quite handle. Well, now you're removing it. So you're going to be just taking that off the plate completely. So you should definitely keep that in mind. I usually, after I do a big foliar spray, I'll usually go through and do a lot of big leafing, the following day. And it's important too, like, PPE, wear some protective stuff, but when you do a foliar, which was all gonna say, like, I go out and big leaf afterwards. So I usually wait a good day afterwards, because you don't want to go out and spray, Perithian or whatever you're going to spray, and then go out there and actively be pulling these things off. And now, it's on your skin, it's on your employees. So, I mean, that's something good to think about as well, is proper PPE while you're doing these IPM sprays, whether it's you're wearing a respirator, a bodysuit, and things like that, that way, nothing's harmful to your employees. That's super crucial as well. But, by removing that foliage, that's going to be a really productive way to remove anything that might be left behind after your spray. So that's going to be very, very important as well.
Awesome. Nate, I have another question.
Yeah.
In your experience, let's say there is an infestation that your preventative sprays did not take care of, and now you have to start a new regimen of sprays and your big leafing and all that. I guess depending on the size of the infestation, what would you say in your experience looks like a certain amount of time that it would take to eradicate a pest infestation?
Well, so this is kind of touches back on their breeding cycles. So when you get an infestation, thinking about their breeding cycle is going to be what really gets you out of the water on that, and hopefully it doesn't happen in your flower period, because like I said before, you're really limited on what you can do. So by breaking up their breeding cycle, if you see, especially mites, a good example, you know, before you get tents and webbing and all this stuff, there's going to be a lot of signs, that you're getting an infestation. It's on its way. And it's usually, you'll see little speckling on the top of your leaves. And that's a good indication. That's why you should always keep a microscope out in your field also, so you can properly identify these things. But, by switching these sprays up and, in an active infestation, by spraying almost daily, every other day, we want to break up that breeding cycle. That's the goal, is breaking up that breeding cycle, because we'll spray tonight and we'll kill off, the majority of these adults, right? Well, the last few days before we've done any of these sprays, they've been laying eggs behind. Now, some of these eggs they may have laid 7 days ago, or they could have laid them last night, but there's a window, a period of time that, even though these adults are dead, their eggs are hatching out consistently. So now this is where, breaking up this breeding cycle really plays a huge factor, by not just switching up the things that we're spraying, but by spraying repeatedly in an active issue like this, every other day or even daily, with certain things like an insecticidal soap or something essential oil based that's not super heavy, and alternating them, But typically, if you're having an active issue, and you're in the vegetative stage, Perithian products are great, as they're going to kill on contact. You know, there's a product, Azera works really great, because it's Perithians and it's also azodactrin, so the Perithians kill on contact. That azodactrin kind of slows everything down. But you really want to focus on breaking up that breeding cycle, and if you're having an active issue, in your vegetative stage, sulfur is something really good and productive to spray. The only downside of sulfur is you really don't want to use any oil-based products, before or after it. If you do, just do a heavy rinse, get that residue off. But sulfur, it's really cheap to spray, but it's super effective. It covers a wide range of things that it'll take care of, including fungal issues. But make a big point of breaking up those breeding cycles, because that's what's actually going to stop that infestation. Because if you're killing the adults, but you're not killing the eggs of the larva, it's just going to progress, and you're just going to be really chasing your tail on it. So really, keep up, if you're spraying even daily, but definitely every other day for a 7 to 10 day period is going to be what is going to, really, get rid of it. And then, after that is a good time to start thinking about the predatory insects that we were talking about, predatory mites and things to kind of put behind them. That way, once you've gotten rid of this infestation, do a bit heavy rinse and then apply your predatory mites, and then they're going to kind of go to work for you and kind of keep the rest of your season going for you. And, no one wants to be out in the field for hours on end spraying. It's hourly costly. It's, you're spending money on products, and you're just, it's really time can be time consuming when you're dealing with an infestation. That's why really I can't put a big enough emphasis on your being preventative, always preventative over reactive, always 100% of the time. So always just kind of think about that breeding cycle of insects and being able to properly identify them, and really just break up that breeding cycle. That's going to be the most productive thing that you can do. So I hopefully that answered your question there.
Yeah, I guess basically it sounds like once you have an infestation, and if you still are in the vegetation state, then you're probably going to be dealing with that for the bulk of your vegetation state until you get to flower, where
Yeah,
you'll bring
and
in
it's
beneficial insects.
yeah, yep. When you go into your flower period, hopefully you don't have an infestation in your flower period, because like I said, it really does limit you, especially, being legal, we go through all these rigorous testings and all these things. So if you're spraying something, midway through flower, especially when you have those bud sites, when you're in veg, you don't have a bud that's gonna, or a flower that's going to like kind of harbor that moisture and whatever you're spraying in it, and it's going to kind of get into it. It's not just on the outside, it's, it's in the inside of these things. So you don't really, ideally, we don't want to spray ever in flower. But if you have to spray in flower, there are a couple things on the market, like there's a couple different things that are kind of enzyme products that you can kind of use, which honestly I kind of want to look up and see. I don't know if that'll test clean or not. It's the cleanest thing that you will spray, but you want to really avoid spraying in flower in general, because the goal is to have the best product out there. We don't want to be, putting something on the market that, maybe we had a bug issue and try to get rid of it. And even though it tests positive, tested good, we just don't want to be dealing with stuff like that, which is why, I always promote beneficial insects. They're super productive. If you get them in the right time after your preventatives, there's not a reason that you should be having any issue during your flowering period. So stay up on your preventatives and then really start thinking about beneficials when you're leading into flower. Uh, they really are productive. When used properly, they're phenomenal.
Awesome. Thank you, Nate. Does
Oh yeah.
anyone have any other questions before we start to wrap up here? Got a couple more minutes left, and Nate is very knowledgeable and ready to answer your questions. If you have any left, let us know in the chat or raise your hand to speak. And if there is no questions, that's fine. Nate, feel free to, continue if you have more of your presentation, or you want to wrap up and let us know ways that we can contact you, and any other information
100%.
you may have.
Yeah, well, thanks everybody for tuning in, and thank you for the Alliance for having on me and inviting me in here. It's always fun getting to see you guys and all the fun events you do. Like I said, I work over at Ag Natural. You can always reach me here. I will put in my email. You can feel free to email me. I'll answer any questions, or you can give a call over to the shop. 530-274-0990, and give me a call. I'm always here. I'm down to answer any questions you guys may have at any time. I'll definitely put some stuff together so you guys have a detailed list as to what's compliant for us to spray in California on our cannabis plants throughout its life cycle. So I'll be attaching that. here later. I'll probably shoot you an email or something. Aaron.
Yeah, feel free to send it to me and I'll distribute it. It's perfect.
Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, I'll look in the comments, feel free to give me a call or just stop in at Ag Natural. And as far as Ag Natural goes, if there's stuff that we're not carrying that illegal farmers are using, I will always order it for you. Come in and talk to Justin Napier, our purchasing agent. He's phenomenal. He'll get you where you guys need to be on ordering things. There's a lot of stuff maybe we don't stock, but we'll get it in rapidly for you, whether it's like, there's a couple different products maybe that we don't carry, but if there's something we don't carry, let us know. I'd love to get it in the store for you. But yeah, come in and talk to Justin. He'll get you the best deals we can figure out for you guys. And if you guys have any pest questions, just stop in the store, give me a call, shoot me an email, and always happy to come and talk to you guys.
Awesome. Thank you, Nate. That was fantastic. I learned a lot myself. I really appreciate you being here with us. You're the best.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Thanks everyone for joining us for another Get Legit webinar. We'll see you next time. Take care,
Yeah.
everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.